Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer. You can call me Matt, and with me today is Jean, the Strategy Wargamer. How are you doing today, Jean?
Not bad, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. So today, we're going to try and touch on a topic that we mentioned last time around, which was underserved conflicts, different wars or what have you that really don't get covered in strategy or wargaming to the extent that, either you or I or, we believe should. But that was going to be the topic last time around, and I think our last episode turned into more of a Hearts of Iron review, which is fine, because, it's an extra episode. I'm looking your way, Jean, as far as what derailed that podcast. But nonetheless, we'll touch on it today, and, hopefully we can talk about some interesting conflicts that haven't been touched on so much. I know we actually are recording this just a day after our last podcast, so... when we usually go around and ask, what have you been playing lately? I know you kind of had Hearts of Iron last time around, but was there anything else that you've been playing lately, Jean, that you kind of wanted to talk about for a little bit?
Yeah, I've been playing the Strategic Command, the new Strategic Command beta from Matrix game that's coming out. I've been really enjoying that. I'm making a video series out of it because I'm honestly, I'm kind of hooked on this game. I can't even wait for the actual release to come out. I'm just nosediving right into the beta, and it's pretty good. It kind of reminds me of like a Commander of the Great War, but World War II side. I really like that because they did a great job with Commander of the Great War, and I played that often on my iPad. And so now they're coming out with Strategic Command, which is basically not a clone, but it's very similar to Commander of the Great War.
Okay. Well, yeah, and the Strategic Command series is something that's been going on for a while. I think it used to be over at Battlefront, right? And it just transitioned over to Matrix games. Yeah,
I was going through the... excuse me, if you guys hear me slurping a little bit, I'm having some bacon fries, so I couldn't resist. But, I stopped by the Battlefront website. I didn't even know Strategic Command came over from the Battlefront side. I was going through their website yesterday to look at some other titles that they had, and what I was thinking about reviewing, and I was kind of like looking at it. I was like, oh, geez, I wonder if they got it from Battlefront. But it looks like Matrix did some refinements to it. Definitely the GUI. They've changed that around, and the sprites. The game is graphically better than from what the screenshots that I saw on Battlefront.com.
Okay, so definitely a newer version of it. Been playing anything else, or is that mainly it?
Well, I do have one game that I just got a copy of. I think it's called RimWorld.
Okay.
And I haven't played it yet. It's on my Steam in queue kind of thing. So I'm planning to do like a first impressions, probably either tonight or tomorrow, and then hopefully I'll get it out. And it's one of the top titles in the Steam indie bundle.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I've been playing mostly... Well, there's two games that I've been playing a bit of. The first is Rule the Waves, and I've got a series that I'm doing with Tortuga Power and XTRG. And Rule the Waves is kind of an early 19th century naval simulation, or more or less it's an early 19th century shipbuilding game that lets you fight your battles out in a tactical map. But really the core of the game is putting you in the shoes of someone like Jackie Fisher or Alfred von Tirpitz and giving you the ability to design your own battleships, design your own cruisers, build your fleet as you see fit, and then navigate through certain strategic choices that a high admiral might have, how to deal with certain crises, how to deal with the prime minister asking for certain advice, and then if war happens, you can fight those battles out on the tactical map. I think the connection between the battles and the ship design doesn't really make a ton of logical sense, in that Jackie Fisher, and I think I mentioned this in our last podcast, wouldn't be jumping into HMS Lion and sailing around at the Battle of Jutland. So that bit falls down a little bit, but I understand the need to show people, how their ships that they've designed and that they've been putting so much effort into are actually able to be fought, because no one wants to build a fleet and have no ability to fight with it and see how it actually performs in combat. So it's an interesting challenge there. I'd like to see them add more of a strategic layer to the wars. Right now, it's basically just kind of ships will engage, I assume, based on what the local commanders decide to do in certain regions. I think if you're really, the first Sea Lord or something like that, you're probably going to have some say in, here I want our policy to be blockading, and here I want our policy to be raiding, and those kind of things, and then kind of leave it at that. I think there could be a little bit more to the strategic element of combat and Rule the Waves, but all in all, it's a really fun game. Having a lot of fun playing it, enjoying it, and I've been running a series on that, so I think I'm 5 episodes in. I've got the 6th in the can that'll come out in a couple days, and then I'll obviously be recording some more. And it's interesting. It's the first series I've ever done, which is a succession series. So I'm going to play the first 5 years, 1900 to 1905. And then I'm going to pass it off to Tortuga Gamer, who will take my fleet that I've designed and that I've been fighting with, and then he's going to basically act like it's a transition of power between Fisher to the next Sea Lord, where he'll have to take my fleet and fight for or play for 5 years with a fleet that wasn't of his choosing. So it's kind of a neat idea of not really having total control over the game itself. And then he'll pass it to XTRG after 5 years, and then they'll pass it back to me. So, I won't see my Navy back until 1915, when one would assume the bulk of it will be scrap heaps, and I'll be dealing with dreadnoughts and battle cruisers and what have you. Other than that, what?
The question I have for you on that game is, how is the pace of, because we were talking in the pre-show about, I was always trying to get my hands on a really good early naval war game for like World War I era, and maybe even earlier. But the curious thing that was in my head was, during that time there was no radar guided guns or missiles and such. So from some of the books I read, it was just basically firing the weapon, giving your best estimation where the enemy will be, and hoping the round will hit the ship. And I think one book said it was like for every 50 to 100 rounds, one would make its mark. So my question to you is, do you find that kind of war, is that shown in the game? And does it dilute the excitement of the game?
I wouldn't say it dilutes the excitement. It definitely shows it. You're not going to hit with the majority of your shots. Obviously, if you close the range, those percentages go up. But it certainly is demonstrated. I think so. There's sort of a twist there, right? If you're talking about a more modern naval combat game like Command Air Naval Operations. Good Lord, sorry guys. A game like that is basically the second you see the enemy, they're dead almost, because you just hit them with a barrage of missiles, and there's no aiming, there's nothing to factor in. In Rule the Waves, you detect an enemy, and great, it's going to take you 2 hours to sink the guy. Not 2 real hours, but 2 hours to sink the guy under a barrage of shells. So there's kind of it's trade-offs, right? I mean, if you're talking about smart weapons, yeah, it makes it easy to destroy someone, but it's all about finding them. In Rule the Waves, it's really more about how you engage them in combat. Do you cross their T, which allows you to bring your entire broadside to bear, and they can only bring a few guns to bear against you? Do you send torpedo boat destroyers in at the right time so they can launch an effective torpedo barrage? It's a very different kind of combat, but I wouldn't say it's any less appealing. Sure, weapons are inaccurate, but that's one of the big things with technology as it develops throughout the game. You've got to research naval technology, and you can put emphasis on certain areas like range finding, which will make your ships more accurate, or damage control, which will make you better able to resist those shells as they do hit you. So it gives you a lot of options and a lot of choices. And then there's just, frankly, there's the ship design component, where you have to decide what trade-offs you want to make there. Do you want to be a really heavily but lighter armament ship, or do you want to be a fast battle cruiser but with not much armor? It's really opening up the playbook and giving you a whole bunch of choices and making you make a lot of key decisions and weighing different trade-offs. And it's really a game about trade-offs. And I think it's really interesting and appealing. The battles component isn't my favorite because it feels a little bit too micro-y in a major fleet engagement. frankly, I don't really want to sit down and play a 2-hour-long battle, which I very well could if I was micromanaging everything. I like the idea of being, the Jellicoe, where you issue certain basic orders, but you're not micromanaging everything down to the T, or even more preferable, something like Winston Churchill, where you're organizing the war from a strategic standpoint, but less so on the tactical level. I wish that was improved a little bit. But, at the end of the day, it's a fun game that I think has a lot of promise, and they're making a sequel, so it'll be interesting how that pans out. I think they're expanding the sequel to go all the way to 1950, and it'll cover air combat as well, which will be interesting to see how they model that. I'm not sure the combat engine they have there really will hold up in a World War II carrier-style game. But it'll be interesting to see. I had preferred that they would move it, earlier. I think the late 1800s have a very interesting period. Everyone always talks about how the Dreadnought revolutionized naval combat and made all previous warships obsolete. But in many ways, the Royal Sovereign class did the same thing on a less dramatic way. And the Royal Sovereign was the first of the pre-Dreadnought battleships. The sort of stereotypical pre-Dreadnought battleship is a heavily armored, 20,000-ish ton battleship, 4 main guns, 2 fore, 2 aft, and a large battery of secondary guns. But it was very different than the ships of 1870 or 1880. And again, in many ways, it revolutionized, slightly less dramatically, naval combat then. So you almost have 2 inflection points in the sort of naval architecture history, that being the pre-Dreadnought era starting in the early 1890s, which threw out a whole bunch of weird, ironclad ram and open barbette, battleships, that just really weird ships that came before 1890, developed into a more traditional sort of format, and then in 1905 taking that format even further with the all big gun battleship Dreadnought. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting game. It's certainly something that I enjoy playing. But as far as Rule the Waves 2, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I also have been playing a bit of Graviteam's Steel Armor, which is a modern-ish tank simulator. It allows you to play either as a T-62 or an M60 tank in a variety of conflicts, which kind of inspired the topic for tonight. So, I know we're talking about underserved conflicts that we don't think get covered enough in war games today. Conflicts that for whatever reason are not something that developers generally touch on. And Graviteam did a really good job addressing that to some extent in their Steel Armor game. It's a tank simulator, so you've got a full interior 3D cockpit of your tank, as well as exterior. And you can play as an individual tank, or you can play as a platoon commander or more in this game. And it covers the Iran-Iraq War, which I don't know if I've ever seen another computer game anyway touch on the Iran-Iraq War. It also touches on the conflict in Angola, which I'm not sure what that war was called, but it has an operation called Operation Hopper, which took place in the 1980s. I believe it was. There was like a civil war in Angola or something to that effect, and it touches on that. And it also touches on Afghanistan from the Russian perspective. So it touches on a lot of conflicts that I don't think get talked about enough in war games today, don't get covered enough in war games today. I think we see war games and we see the same old get trotted out. World War II over and over and over again. You see World War I a fair amount. Napoleonics gets a pretty good amount of coverage. And other than that, there's not a lot. There certainly are some hypothetical Cold War games that get covered for conflicts that didn't really occur. But
I would also say Civil War, too, probably took a good chunk.
Yeah, Civil War, that's a good point. The American Civil War definitely has a lot of games about it. But I really think, so, like, in my opinion, if I was going to say what are the wars that don't get covered enough, I think, to me, the most glaring, I would say Vietnam and Korea for sure, but I would also say, to me, the most...
Vietnam hasn't been covered. I feel like 10-15% of the games that are coming out, probably around 10% actually, been featured Vietnam. Matrix came out with a few of them, right? I know They came out one for the iPad desktop version. I forgot the name of the game.
They had one that was called Vietnam 65, which was kind of like an operational level game, very abstracted, but it kind of is like putting you in the shoes of a commander of forces in the Ia Drang Valley or some analogous geographic region in Vietnam. It doesn't really specify anywhere, and gives you control of the combat there, as well as some political components of making decisions on what forces you want to call in, which then influences your political points. But that's one game. I'm trying to think of anything else that's been modern that has covered Vietnam. I know the developers of the shooter, I think it was Rising Sun, which came out of Red Orchestra 2, are working on an FPS for Vietnam. I think there was some, Company of Heroes Vietnam stuff. I could be wrong. That might have been a mod. But I guess what I'm saying when I say Vietnam is I have not seen a strategic level Vietnam war game in at least 20 years.
I think Vietnam is hard to do strategically because, with Vietnam, and Hearts of Iron community has a big, I'm a big proponent in Hearts of Iron for a modern day Cold War game. And what rages on the forums is how do you do a strategic level Vietnam game? Because Vietnam on the map is just like a sliver of Asia. And you could break it out into more provinces, but it's, you have too many mechanics, I think. You have land mechanics, and you have air mechanics, and you have naval mechanics. You all have to work properly, and they all have to fit. And a lot of times, it's a small, if you take Vietnam, maybe even include Cambodia, maybe parts of China, it wouldn't be a big map. And the game, I feel like wouldn't last long. I feel like Vietnam would become a great part of a greater conflict, with East versus West from Paradox when they were making that game. I felt like that was going to be perfect. We don't have an actual strategic level Vietnam game, but you can take scenario, put it into East versus West, and then add Korea too, and maybe some other wars to kind of give them their just due. But I feel like it's really hard to do a Vietnam strategic level game. I played tons of tactical level games. John Tiller has a bunch of them that are really great, but I agree with you. Strategically, I think it's really hard to do. You have to have a development that can get the mechanics just right. And
I don't disagree, but to me, Vietnam, if you really want to cover Vietnam and understand what the challenges were to winning the conflict in Vietnam, you cannot cover it at a tactical level. You can get some of the components right in a tactical level. Sure, maybe you get ambushed by guerrilla forces, maybe you don't really know where the bad guys are. Vietnam 65 by Matrix does a decent job of this, where, the VC will show up somewhere and then you'll never be able to catch them. They disappear into the ether. You can catch some of those components, but if you ignore the strategic political component of the game, I don't think you're really telling the story of Vietnam. And I agree it's difficult, but I wouldn't say that. I think where it becomes difficult is figuring out how you mold, how you capture the strategic and political considerations and the guerrilla combat, and you model that within the traditional air, land, sea components of it. Because Vietnam is covered from a flight sim perspective. I've seen numerous flight sims that talk about Vietnam. It is covered from a tactical land combat perspective. Maybe not as much as you'd think you would see, but somewhat. But I've never seen a political Vietnam game, and the war was a political war. You have to figure out, how is South Vietnam going to maintain its control over its people? How is it going to avoid falling to the South? How are the Americans going to support it in a way that's politically acceptable? I've seen 2 games that cover it. One was Nam 1965 to 67 or 75, and I think that came out in the 80s. And I stumbled across it, and it's basically you can call in certain forces, certain units, and then send certain units back to America, and they have political costs. And the more casualties you take, the bigger the political costs. And every season, the VC and the NVA will try and launch an offensive or do something, and you kind of have to respond to that and prevent the South from falling. But you've got this, this ever ticking clock, and it involves, some level of, financial aid for South Vietnam. You can try and really load up on the money if you want instead of sending in troops. It also makes you make decisions about how you want to fund, the air campaign against North Vietnam. But it's 20 or 30 years old, and I haven't seen anyone try that since. And yes, you're right. It could be a difficult war to cover, but I don't see how it's any more difficult than the Pacific Theater in World War II, where you have air, land, and sea, restraints. The biggest thing is the additional political component and the fact that the combat isn't purely conventional. But I do think it makes for a really fascinating and interesting game. If you're trying to present people with limited choices and limited ability to influence outcomes and really make them think about what they're doing in a unique and interesting way, I think Vietnam, more than anything, is a blank canvas that can really shine if done right. I'm not saying it's easy, but I don't feel like I've seen much beyond flight sims or games that touch kind of obliquely on it. So you've got the Twilight Struggle, which is like a Cold War card game. So yeah, sure, theoretically Vietnam's in there. You've got trying to think of it, any other game that touches on the Cold War, to your point, would touch on it. Command Modern Air Naval Operations touches on it. They have Vietnam scenarios. Oh, yeah. But what I'd really like to see is a game that really addresses the Vietnam conflict on its own and doesn't treat it as some sort of periphery. If you're talking from an American perspective, and I think, obviously both you and I are, Vietnam is a war that had such a huge impact on the United States in the 20th century and to this day, and it's never really been addressed in an all-encompassing way. I would say Korea's been even more neglected, both from a tactical combat and air combat component, as well as the strategic component. But I think Korea is easier in the sense that it's a much more conventional conflict. And it doesn't have quite the same political connotations that Vietnam does. I would say it's a slightly less interesting war to cover from a game perspective, although it's also neglected. I'm trying to think of any games that touch on it. You've got Theater of War, right?
Now the question I have for you is: do you feel like there's no demand for it, or is there's no demand from the customer base, or do you feel like developers don't know how to tackle that issue?
Which, Vietnam or Korea?
Well, both, because I barely see games from of each, So I don't know if developers or publishers are coming forward and saying, well, we're not investing into Vietnam because there's no demand, or if they're saying, well, we're not investing in these types of errors because we don't know how to physically develop a game that will be accepted, that will be fun to play, something that would be as good as, other errors that they can define. Like, for example, they make World War II games because, obviously there's a great deal of interest there, but it's also a game that, somebody will pay $60 because the scope of it is huge, and when you play Korea, there's not that much. Again, the war went on for a number of years, but you don't have as large a scope as World War II or World War I, where you have a Pacific theater, Eastern theater, Western theater, a what-if scenario of mainland U.S. Invasion by Germany, and you have so much. But in Korea or Vietnam, and you have just this tiny little peninsula, or just this scrap part of sliver of Asia. So I feel like, I think maybe they're not developing them, maybe because the customer base is like, well, look, I'm not paying $60 or $50, whatever, for a game that, the scope is not really there. Do you feel like it's that?
I don't think it's the scope at all. I think, sure, geographically you're right. They weren't as all-encompassing conflicts as World War II. I don't think that's why World War II is popular at all. World War II is not popular because, sure, the epic scale certainly has something to do with it. But remember, a lot of World War II games don't even touch on everything in there that you're talking about. the East versus, or not East versus West, good Lord, that never came out. And that was about the Cold War. Gary Grigsby's, what is it, East Front, or whatever the name of it is, just covers the Russian front. Just the Russian front. It's a much more narrow... Now, granted, certainly millions of people fought and died there, and it was a vast theater in of itself, but it's one piece of World War II that gets covered. West Front only covers the conflict in Italy and France and Germany. So you're not looking at, any of the wider war. I don't think that has anything to do with the lack of appeal for Korea. I think you can make a West Front style game, a game like Gary Grigsby's West Front. And I think that could touch on Korea. You could model in a way that it wouldn't feel any less epic, it wouldn't feel any smaller, and it would, be just as compelling. I think the reason that you don't see games on Korea is in the American psyche that the war is kind of, it's known as the forgotten war. It's known as the war that people just kind of don't talk about and kind of forget about, which is sad. 50,000 plus Americans fought and died there, as well as thousands of UN troops from various different nations and, hundreds of thousands of people from Korea. But I don't think it has anything to do with the size of the conflict. I think it has to do with the conflict in the collective memory of us as Americans. It's not a big part of American culture. It's not a big part of American lore. It is a conflict you can kind of argue is sort of the good versus evil. North Korea attacks South Korea, so you've got a clear-cut enemy. You've got a clear, bad action that's conducted by the North, but I think you also have a problem where there's no clear victory. The Americans were moving toward victory, and then China gets involved and muddles the situation, and the war ends in stalemate. And who wants to model a war that doesn't really end? At least not in a positive sense, right? And I think that's another thing that Vietnam struggles with. I think Vietnam struggles because, first of all, I think every war gamer wants a game where it's clearly, I may be exaggerating here, but generally we like games where there's a clear good side and a bad side. You want to be able to demonize the enemy. You want to be able to prop up your side. And World War II is the picture-perfect example of evil guys on one side and, look at us righteous people on the other side. And yes, I can feel good about fighting this conflict. Oh, and by the way, it has all the ancillary benefits of being huge, epic in scope, very compelling from a combat perspective, and it has a definitive ending point and a definitive result. You win. Someone wins, whether it's Germany if you're playing on the bad side and maybe you kind of got a rebellious streak and you want to play as the Germans, or you have maybe family members or something like that with German heritage, or whether you're playing as the United States and you end up winning by dropping nukes on Japan. It has a very set end, and Korea doesn't have that. And Vietnam is worse because it has an end that America traditionally loses. And I think Vietnam is more complicated because it's also a conflict that's very hard to understand. What does victory look like? You're not going to roll into North Vietnam and take over Hanoi. That's not what the Vietnam War was about. So I think that's a struggle. I think Korea is a struggle because there's not as much demand there because it's not a collective piece of American memory. I think Vietnam is difficult because it's not a positive memory in American history. It's not this was a positive end result and we can feel good about fighting this conflict that in many ways tore this country apart. So it's very difficult, I think, in either of these conflicts for there to be a big market for these games. But just because it's not what people are asking for and saying that, yes, that's what I want to play, I don't think means developers shouldn't take the risk. And it's easy for me to say, sitting behind my computer and my microphone, to say, it doesn't matter if there's not a huge economic profit out there to be made. You go and make a good game on it, and you can make some money, and you can convince people to play this. Because I think that's true. I think people will, if you design a tight, very well-done game that touches on Vietnam in unique and interesting ways and can be really compelling, which I think can be done, I think the game could sell. But that's not easy. It's much easier to come out and say, we're going to release the 58th game this year on World War II, because everybody loves World War II.
And I feel like, at this point, how many times can you duplicate World War II? I feel like that every developer and publisher makes another World War II game. I feel like it's just a mirror of the last one, It's just It gets to the point where
yeah.
we need to focus on other conflicts, and also, you know, you know what it drives me nuts is like off your point is like, you know, I have a couple other conflicts in mind that I wanted to mention, but like Cold War game, you know, and we do have a few titles out there. One that you just mentioned recently, I just got on the iPad. But like, you know, East versus West, you know, that was going to be a great Cold War game, and you know, there's such a demand for that's actually a game that is a big audience. They're demanding from Paradox that, hey man, make a game like this. There's mods out there that you know, that take Hearts of Iron 3 and try to replicate a Cold War scenario, and there was so much public demand for it. They started a game for it, which they never finished. I just don't understand. I mean, you know, Paradox went along and made Hearts of Iron 4, right? Which, again, is, you know, you have the Hearts of Iron series. I love them. But after 4 World War II Hearts of Iron games, they can move to another conflict. You know, like, I don't understand why they don't even do, like, a modern-day equivalent of Hearts of Iron, where we can, you know, do something between, like, the War on Terror or something like that. You know, I don't understand why companies get stuck in these riffs of like, well, we're going to have Europa Universalis. Oh, that was a great game. We're going to make a second one, a third one, a fourth one. Granted, they're great games, but be a little experimental, be a little dangerous, and, you know, try other conflicts, try other, you know, time periods. And I feel like developers like, look, we know Hearts of Iron 4 or Hearts of Iron 5 is going to sell this many copies. It's guaranteed. It's the safe bet. And I feel like developers and publishers need to take the not safe bet, you know, the risky bet, you know, because that's what makes history. I mean, that's what happened with Apple. I mean, when Apple came out with the iPhone, that really a capacitive touchscreen phone that wasn't done yet. And it was a big risk, and Apple threw all their chips in it. And
well, LG did it. But...
LG?
They had a phone that looked exactly like the iPhone, and I believe it was a touchscreen as well previously. But I'm just trolling you a bit there.
Oh, but I mean, you know, that's what we developers and publishers need to do. They need to take risks, because the communities want. I think even the common casual gamers are at this point even getting sick and tired of World War II games. I mean, me and you and a majority of you know. Strategy Wargamers, old, you know, us that have been playing it for decades, you know, we're already tired of it. But you have people that just, you know, play it casually, and they're saying, wow, there's not, you know, they're noticing it. You know, the regular casual gamers are already noticing there's so many World War II games out there. And I feel like they need to kind of branch out, you know. But one game that I wanted, one period of that I want, besides the Cold War, the modern day, I wanted them to focus on maybe like a strategic or a tactical level game on the Battle of Thermopylae, you know, the legendary 300. I would love to see a game of that, you know, tactical.
Trying to think if there's been anything. I think there was some. It kind of falls into the Vietnam bucket, where there were definitely some games that were back, you know, in the 80s and 90s, in the early days of computer gaming, that I believe touched on that. But I'm not sure if I've seen anything more recent. You know,
the problem with those kind of games, it's hard to get a system to run it. Like, I have like Windows 7. It will run some games from the 90s, but I've heard some gamers saying that you have to you have to do a lot of altering to your computer to make those old 1980s games to run.
Yeah, you need like DOSBox or whatever. Yeah, they're certainly not easy to run. I'm not saying that it substitutes. I think you're right. I think it could benefit from a return, or not a revision, but a return back to that genre. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I wonder if
branch out, right?
Is Thermopylae the best battle to cover, though? I mean, I know obviously it's, you know, it's certainly a big talking point in history. It's certainly a compelling story, but from a game perspective, from a game design perspective, is lining a couple, you know, it wasn't just the 300, there were some other Greek soldiers there as well, but is lining up, you know, 300 or, you know, 5,000 men in a narrow front with no ability to maneuver really going to be a compelling game? I guess that's the other question is, you know, to your point, Vietnam could be a difficult war to cover in a compelling way for a developer. Is Thermopylae any less so?
I don't know. I think every game you can I think it depends on the developer. If you design a game properly, any game can be fun, exciting. You just have to design it the right way. I'll give you a good example. I mean, like, well, I mean, I don't know if this is a good example, but like Rourke's Drift, I would probably put, what kind of his name? Jeff Lapkoff, I believe, formerly of ISI Games, developed a game called The Drift, I believe it's called. I did a review about it like a year or two ago.
Oh yeah,
and,
I remember seeing that.
Yeah, and he made a game about it, and a lot of people were, there were some people that were like, well, I don't know if they should make a game like this. It's not going to be really exciting. I mean, it's going to be kind of like the Alamo, and it's really hard to get a tactical game that will, be exciting. I played this game, and it was, kept me on the edge of my seat. I played it for hours, and I thought it was incredible because the way he designed it was, it was innovative, and I liked the way he did it. He did it from like a top-down approach. Added some random events to it, and I felt like a part of the Rourke's Drift. I was trying to keep it afloat, and I really enjoyed that game and the way he designed it. And I didn't think they were going to be able to do a Rourke's Drift game that was going to be fun and exciting, but he did it. I think it comes down to the developer. If the developer is innovative, I think they can get it done.
To your point, they should do one on, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but Iseldowandia or whatever, which, was the battle that happened before Rourke's Drift, where like 2,000 British soldiers got wiped out by the Zulu.
Yeah.
I think there was a game, there were a game or two that touched on the Zulu Wars in general. I think those games, the problem with any of those colonial games, if you're looking at colonial history, or like even you could do the conquest of India. I don't know if that's ever really been touched on, the British, gradual conquest of India outside of Victoria II's sort of abstract look at it. But, those games have so much political baggage. Even more so perhaps than Vietnam, where it's like, yeah, Europe is going and taking over and slaughtering, all these tribes and people in Africa, and not enslaving them directly, but certainly, taking over their countries, taking their land. And I think it's difficult to portray that kind of a game in a way that you make the gamer not feel horrible about themselves. I think the tactical perspective is probably the only way to do it, kind of to your point, where you're talking about, hey, you're going to go ahead and, fight a specific action, because that kind of removes some of that political baggage, to your point. Rourke's Drift is really interesting, but I think there's more to play there than there is with Thermopylae. What might make sense with Thermopylae is, instead of just doing it on Thermopylae, maybe you could still have it be a tactical combat game, but maybe it's a campaign that has multiple scenarios that touch on the entire Persian Wars, in which it allows you to fight, different battles like Marathon as well. Or maybe you fight the Peloponnesian Wars, which I also don't think has been covered a lot. I'm not sure. One of the Hegemony games, I believe, touches on the Greek conflicts as well. But it certainly isn't something that, I don't think those Greek wars are covered in a great extent. But yeah, do you have any other wars that you were interested in kind of seeing more, or seeing them be represented?
Well, I mean, the only other wars that I can think of that were on my plate were, and they were not big conflicts. I would probably have to say Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, were probably on my list, and the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War. Oh, and the biggest one I would say is probably the War of 1812.
Okay.
I did want to find a game that did that conflict justice. I mean, it was not a big American war, but it was a war that we kind of went toe-to-toe with the British, and without the help of the French, and, kind of stood our ground as the United States.
Got our capital burnt to the ground, but,
Yeah, minus that, yeah. But, and then you also had Old Ironside. She got her name from that war. But, I figure, it wouldn't be like a grand conflict, but it would be a great strategy, maybe even a tactical game.
I wonder if you do it right, though. Can't a smaller conflict be more compelling, because you're really restricting the user? You're like, sorry, you don't have 800,000 men to throw at invading Western Europe, and if you lose 50,000, so what? I mean, it really makes you think about what you're gonna do, and really drives home the impact of any mistake or any decision or any victory in that sort of a scenario where, hey, you've only got 2,000 men and you're trying to invade Canada with 2,000 men. Good luck. Just from a geographic standpoint. I agree. 1812 is not covered. I think one of the things that it's difficult with any of the colonial games that we've talked about, or even the Spanish-American War, is they're really, when you're looking at one side that has such a clear advantage over the other, it's hard to make a compelling game, right? I mean, you're saying like, okay, United States, you've got 5+ battleships, and Spain has like 2 armored cruisers. Okay, make a game out of that. Well, one side smashes the other, and the end.
But wouldn't that be like a great challenge to the player that can play as the Spanish and defeat U.S.?
Yeah, if you force them to play as Spain, but again, if you're making it like an impossible scenario for them to play too, it's not going to appeal to many people. And I know we've kind of said, hey, who cares about who it appeals to? But there's certain realities, right? If you're a game developer, you've got to mix new and unique theaters and discussions and topics with something that is somewhat compelling to play, and I don't think steamrolling an enemy or being steamrolled every time you play is necessarily the most compelling. But I think you're absolutely on with something with the War of 1812, because Britain was distracted by Napoleon for the majority of that conflict, and they never really brought to bear the full forces of their empire. And the Americans, meanwhile, were doing they were conflicted at home as well, so they never really fully unified behind the war. And it's a really interesting conflict that kind of has a lot of ebbs and flows in it. We burned Toronto. They burned, I think it was it York? Was it York? We burned York, but I thought that's what Toronto ended up being called. I think I'm wrong there, actually. But we burned, a prominent Canadian city. They come back and burn D.C. One of the biggest battles takes place after the war is over in New Orleans. So it's got that scope that you were talking about, where it's a pretty large theater. The Eastern theater in the U.S., the Canadian border, all the way down to New Orleans. You've got the naval components of the plucky American frigates trying to deal with, the massive British fleet that's somewhat distracted, but still, can easily bring forces to bear against the United States, but doesn't take them totally seriously. You've got the political components of, the British not really wanting to deal with it, the Americans really being conflicted at home on whether they want to fight it. I think 1812 is a gold mine for at least a couple of good games. I think there have been a few games that have touched on it, but I guess nothing that's really drawn me in and be like, damn, this is a great game that I need to play. And I think that's what I'm kind of looking for. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, because I was going to change the topic a little bit.
Well, what I was thinking is, since you mentioned it earlier, I was thinking, you were mentioning a couple of 1980s games, and it just came, popped in my head. Well, what we need, since it's 2016, and you have a lot of 1980s games, that were really amazing. What we should really do, what developers and publishers should really do, is remaster those games. Take those beautiful titles that we had in the 1980s that were legendary titles, remaster them with new graphics, make them compatible with the latest operating systems, maybe even make a mobile platform of these games, and just remaster it. Kind of like the way they did with Call of Duty now with the latest PS4. I mean, they just took that game, remastered it, and it sold a ton, right? Why can't we do that with old strategy war games?
Well, they got to be good, and I don't know if anyone would say a lot of those 1980s games are good in that perspective. I like the idea, so I think what you really need to do is you need to take those games, and it's not just a reskin and making it look pretty. You need to completely overhaul some of those user interfaces, which are incomprehensible in a lot of those games, and you'd probably need to alter the game a lot too. The game itself. I don't think it would just be a remaster. I do like the idea of revisiting them, and maybe you create like a newer version of the old game, but in many ways it will have to play completely differently than those games did play. But at least it's an area that I think developers could go back to and look for inspiration, right? I mean, maybe it's not just a remaster, but it's something where it's like, okay, this game did things this way. It's an interesting idea. It's something that's not covered at all recently. I'm going to borrow a lot from this game and then, put a modern twist on it and make a better game, if you will. So I think you're right. I think developers can look back and see what has been covered in the past and how can I improve on that and do that better. Because I think the 80s and the early 90s certainly had a wider variety of conflicts that were covered. I don't know how many of them were covered particularly well, and maybe that's why we don't see any of those kind of games today, is because they didn't sell well. But I think it's been long enough where you could try something new. I think Pike and Shot did relatively well for Matrix games. It seemed to, and that was how many games have come out that have talked about, I think that's covering the English Civil War, right? So how many games have come out that have covered that era? Not many. And my understanding from an outsider's looking in is that game did relatively well. It at least didn't fall on its face, and seemed to be pretty popular with most people that I knew. So, that's a war that never gets covered, and they did it, and it did all right. One other war that I wanted to mention, and I know why it's not covered, but I think is a crime that it's not, because from a wargamer perspective, it's fascinating. The Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah.
So, it's covered by Gravity.
That was a bloody war. That was brutal.
It was World War II. It was World War I. Tactics and bloodshed, and it's interesting. Graviteam covers it in steel armor from a tanker's perspective, and that's what really fueled this whole discussion and this idea of this topic. But I know why it's not covered. Okay, you've got a hostile Muslim nation fighting a Muslim nation that will be hostile to the United States before computer games get big. Right, you got our enemy in Iraq versus, if you're from an American perspective, you got an enemy in Iraq and you've got an enemy in Iran. Both countries who have either taken American hostages and created crises within America, or America has outrightly fought. So it's politically charged, right? I don't think many Americans have an appetite to go out and play as Iran or play as Iraq, but it is a travesty, in my opinion, that war is not covered. I think there might be a few board games that touch on it. I don't know if John Tiller has anything with it, but damn, that's a war with modern. When was the last war between relatively equal sides that involved modern technology? Relatively modern tanks, relatively modern aircraft, and relatively even sides. Iran and Iraq were in a stalemate for 8 years, more or less. And chemical weapons get used. Again, it's not a war that anyone's going to feel good about playing, because, you've got atrocities out the wazoo. It's not a war politically that many Americans are going to want to play, rightly or wrongly. But if ever there was a war game that you would say, this is a war that has not been touched on, and it's really not been touched on because the vast majority of game developers come at it from an American perspective. Like, let's be honest, the majority of the wargaming market seems to be in the United States, so we get very American-centric games. But it's a war that should be covered. It's a war that Americans don't know anything about, and we probably should, because a lot of what's going on in the Middle East, or at least up until Arab Spring, really had echoes of the Iran-Iraq war. A lot of, we're dealing with Iran as a major nemesis in the United States, and I don't know if we really understand them, and this is a big part of their modern history. It certainly was true for Iraq before we overthrew the regime there. I mean, it's a conflict that there's so many opportunities, both politically, militarily, if you want to cover it on a tactical level, a strategic level. There is a wealth of opportunity there that I think should be touched on, but it would be very difficult to sell. So
do you feel like maybe the reason they don't do that is because it's like, I think to your point earlier, is they don't understand, they don't understand that war, because in World War II, I mean, you had the good guys and the bad guys. We know who the bad guys were, who the good guys were. In Iran versus Iraq war, I mean, it's kind of more of a muddy field, who do you play?
Well, from an American perspective, you've got the bad guys versus the bad guys, right? And you don't want anyone to win.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Eastern Front, World War II. You have you didn't have a good side or a bad side. You had two bad sides going at it.
Yeah, although I think Americans in general will still side with the Soviet Union in that case, because you've got, well, I mean, maybe not, but you certainly have, you're fighting the commies, which is an easy sell for Americans, or you're fighting the Nazis, which is an easy sell for Americans. I suppose you could say the same thing for Iran, Iraq, but I don't think it resonates in that way. But yeah, I mean, I guess you're right about the Eastern Front. We don't see a ton of American-focused Eastern Front games either. There are some, and I think the majority of the games that are out there appeal to people's sense of scale and desire to play an epic game, which certainly the Eastern Front had in spades. But yeah, I guess I just... it's a really interesting conflict, in my opinion, where Iran's got a lot of interesting strategic decisions that they have to make. They've got fighter aircraft that only, for example, supposedly, this is what I've heard, the government of Iran, the Islamic, not state, but the regime there, the theocratic regime there, had to go in and convince old pilots who were part of the Shah's Air Force this may be a apocryphal story, but I've heard it multiple times. They had to convince them to, fly their, I think, F-4 Phantoms to defend against Iraqi airstrikes. And, these are people that similar members of the Shah's reign, which the, Iran revolution overthrew, were being, imprisoned. They were being killed because of their ties to, Western imperialism. But they needed these fighter pilots because they didn't have any who were trained who could fly. So apparently the story goes is that these pilots agreed, with the exception of that they had to be allowed to play the old Iranian national anthem over the radio while they flew, which flew completely in the face of the revolutionary government. But the revolutionary government had to accept their ultimatum because they didn't have anyone who was trained to fly, and they couldn't defend the capital of Tehran against Iraqi airstrikes without that. So it's an interesting story, but the Iran-Iraq war, it's not covered in a lot of ways, to the extent, not just games, media doesn't cover it. I was going through Audible. I listened to Audible a lot on my way to work, and I was going through, a list of titles of, what do I want to buy? And I thought, hey, it'd be really interesting is a history on the Iran-Iraq war. There's nothing. There's World War II in spades, but there's nothing. There are books on it, but no one's ever turned any into audiobooks that are on Audible because I guess Americans don't want to listen to a conflict about two Muslim nations fighting each other, which I think is a shame. We wonder, and I'm not going to make this too much of a political statement, but we wonder how we end up in some of the situations that we are in the world today, and we don't really understand our those countries that are adversaries of ours. I mean, I think it's safe to say whether you agree that they should be or that they shouldn't be. Iran is an adversary of the United States today, and we often, it seems, don't understand our adversaries in most conflicts we get involved in. Maybe it's because we don't pay enough attention to their history and to their past and to what motivates them. I don't know. I mean, I still think it would be a compelling game to play, I guess is my point.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I think if we understood their side, or understood adversaries, maybe they would avoid a lot of wars.
I don't know if it would avoid the wars. I'm not making a political judgment on them being adversaries is necessarily wrong or right. I'm not saying anything like that. All I'm saying is I think maybe we'd avoid conflicts, or at the very least maybe we'd be more effective in our conflicts if we did understand our adversaries better. You can say we shouldn't fight them.
World War I. When at the end of World War I, when they had the Paris Peace Conference and they were splitting up the entire world, and they just drew shapes on a map, and if they understood the geographical and people in those areas, and instead of making Iraq, they set up a side for the Kurds, another side for the Sunnis, maybe we might not have been involved in the Iraq War, because the whole political landscape would have changed. But
who knows? I mean, that's certainly. I guess we can go back and blame the British and the French for divvying up the Middle East, and then now the U.S. is the lone superpower on the stage, so we've got to deal with the mess they created. So, thanks a lot, France and Britain.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you was because I was thinking, what would be the most amazing war game if I had to choose. If I had to design my own game from scratch, and I was thinking about this while we were talking about these conflicts, because it's great to have a Vietnam War conflict, and then play a Korea War conflict, and then so on and so on. But one thing that I want, which would kind of combine all of them. And Hearts of Iron and Victoria and Paradox does this really well, to set up a game that can cover the strategic and tactical aspects, maybe more so on the strategic, because tactical and strategic is hard to do together. But set up a game where you can start, like, let's say in 1775, right? The American Revolution, and have a game go from 1775 all the way to, let's say, present day. The game would be quite large. It would be a massive game. But what would be amazing about this game is, you can serve all those conflicts, the American Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and so on, right? But the beautiful thing about a game like that is, and why I love Hearts of Iron games, is the forces that you fought the Korean conflict with, the divisions you developed, the commanders that you had in the field, they can they can translate into the Vietnam War, and then they can translate into the Cold War. You can keep track of your forces, decommission naval vessels, and recommission new ones, and upgrade naval vessels, and upgrade divisions. And I feel the continuity of going from war to war and actually adapting your forces and controlling your forces and developing your forces would be probably, for me, the best strategic war game ever made. If Paradox does something like that, I think I wouldn't have to look anywhere else.
Well, I think what you're asking for is for someone to make a Civ of war games, a Civilization war game. Because that's kind of the idea of Civilization, right? You take your nation from its inception way back in the Stone Age, and kind of lead your civilization through to the modern day. What you're basically talking about is taking that approach, but from a military-only game, which focuses more on, designing your force. In some ways, Rule the Waves models that too. It's just over a much narrower scope, where you've got it, you build your ships, you can upgrade them, you can modernize them, you can replace them and scrap them with new designs, and, your forces gain or lose experience over time. I think you're right. I think it would be like a Civ war game, basically, and I think it'd be interesting. I don't know how it would play out, but it would be interesting. I guess my perspective of what the best war game you could make would be, in all honesty, I think the most compelling war game out there could cover Vietnam. The more I think about it, the more I think about what not unique necessarily, but what a complex and interesting a complex and interesting war it was, just from a purely academic perspective. And if you could get that right in a game, there are so many layers to it. It could be so deep and so complex. Maybe it's just a political simulator that puts you in charge of the U.S. forces or something like that, or maybe you're LBJ or something. I don't know. There's a really interesting game. It was called Escalation, and it was a web-based kind of education game, which put you in the role of LBJ from like 64 to 68, I think it was, and you got presented with these different historical documents and historical actions, and you had to make a decision, like, do I want to send 20,000 more troops? Westmoreland is asking for 20,000 more men. Do I listen to him? Do I not listen to him? And then, if you send them, maybe you have greater casualties but more military success than historically was the case. Maybe you don't send them and Vietnam falls. And you could even get to the point where, like, you could trigger a nuclear war over your decisions if you made bad ones. So it was, there's one where it's like, let's use nuclear weapons against the North directly to stem the tide of NVA troops heading south, and you can nuke a base, and that happens. And I think if you do that again, then I think China or Russia or something start to respond, and it spirals out of control. But I think it's a really interesting game that was more or less made for a classroom environment to kind of show the challenges that LBJ had to face and make, decisions he had to make. And, it ended up being used for educational purposes, much more, here's documents that you have to read that tell you what's going on. But I think if you did something like that for Vietnam, it could be fascinating, in my opinion. I think that would be the ideal war game to me. At least in something. I would play a game like that. Yeah, it's not something that you see, right? Maybe it's not, action-packed enough for the average audience, but it would certainly be something that I would love to see.
Well, I'm hoping publishers and developers hear your hear your design right there, and hopefully, you know, get to the office tomorrow and say, you know what, let's do it,
Yeah, right.
and then give you a nice little credit at the end of the game.
Sure, right. I'm gonna have that kind of influence on a developer. Um, I think
Well,
that's
yeah, I mean,
the interesting thing about war games to me is that it's really the only, or not the only, but it's one of the few genres where you can still have kind of an individual shop do this on the side. So I've mentioned previously that I'm on on the Scourge of War team, and it's kind of a part-time gig for everybody involved, where they kind of create these games on the side. Everyone has their normal day jobs. It's not it's not their profession per se. And I feel like, war games are one of the rare genres where you can still do that and put together a decent product that is worth some people purchasing. I don't think that's true in shooters. I think you just need too many resources and it's too much effort to really have just a couple of guys do it. Maybe some of the side-scrolling RPG games can do it, but it's interesting because I think it opens up more possibility. Like, this doesn't have to be a game that does $1 million in sales. If it's a passion project for you as a developer, like if you have a passion for Vietnam, you can do it. And it may take you 5-10 years to build, but theoretically you can make this game on the side and cover the Vietnam War and do something that nobody's done before. And maybe it won't sell, right? I mean, I think that's been all the wars we've been talking about. Another one that I've seen coming up in the chat a bit here is that you could cover the Yugoslav wars. The wars as Yugoslavia breaks up in the early '90s. That's another conflict you could definitely cover. I think the only game I've ever seen that touches on it sort of indirectly is Falcon 4.0 from a flight sim perspective. The Allied Force one, which has a campaign over Bosnia and Herzegovina, or however you pronounce that, and I suck at pronunciations, everybody, so I'm really sorry about that. But I think the biggest drawback that in any of these conflicts that we've been talking about, the biggest challenge is finding an audience to buy it, right? I mean, let's be real. Developers are trying to put food on the table. They're trying to make ends meet. But if you find a subject that's really passionate, that a developer is really passionate about, they could do it on the side of their day job. I'm not saying they have to. I'm not saying like, oh, feel bad that you don't do it. You don't, it's not your living. There certainly are a lot of war game developers who they develop games for a living, but not all of them do. And, that I think that opens up more opportunity to say, like, this could just be a side passion project and you could cover this in a unique and an interesting way. And, maybe you'll make a little bit of money off of it, but, maybe it's just the act of creating this game that's a big part of it too. No one wants to do something for nothing, but I think it's less restrictive. You don't have to make $5 million at the end of the day for it to be successful, especially if you're a 3 or 4 man shop too. The needs are less.
Yeah, and I also think that that I think some independent developers, people that are like designing their own game, they figure they they make the game, and they don't want to deal with the marketing of the game because they don't have the resources to market it.
Sure.
But one thing that I do encourage people, because there's tons of developers out there, I'm sure a lot of them are thinking about making their own games, maybe on some of the conflicts that we've been talking about. But one thing that I would love for them to see is make your game, send it to you, Matt, and to me, and instead of you having to do marketing, we kind of will market the game for you because we'll put it on the channel, and you have hundreds of subscribers, or you probably have thousands of subscribers that will watch your view of that game, and instead of him having or her doing the marketing for the game, just give the game to you, play the game, say, hey, man, this is a great game about Vietnam. I encourage everybody to play it because I really enjoy it. And boom, his sales will skyrocket. And, I think that would be a great outlet for a lot of independent developers that just want to make the game and don't want to deal with any of the marketing side or anything like that because, that's really difficult, going to wargamer.com and saying, hey, I need to book some advertisement space on your banners and stuff like that. A lot of indie developers don't want to do that, but they can utilize reviewers like me and you to kind of represent their game, to kind of get their name out there.
Yeah, I'd be interested. So, I mean, I cover a lot of different games on my channel. I'd be interested to know what if any, influence I've had on sales for those games. I'm sure there's some. I know of people who've told me they've bought it because I've covered it. But, I'm always curious what that looks like. YouTube is a phenomenal outlet for getting exposure to games, but it definitely has a huge impact on AAA games. I imagine it has an impact on smaller games as well. I'm just really curious to know what that has been. I'm not in any way kind of discounting what you're saying. I think it certainly behooves the indie developer to try and get their hands, their game in the eyes of their customers, and YouTube does that in a way that I don't think anywhere else can right now. But I'm always curious. I really want to know what that conversion rate is, right? Like, there's no visibility into it as far as a YouTuber is concerned, into knowing how many sales did you drive, or how do you, how does a developer know how valuable one YouTuber is over another? I've never actually done a video that was an advertisement directly per se. I suppose I know a lot of people who do. But again, it's just, how effective is it? Do you have any idea? Like, do you have affiliate links on anything you've done where you've been able to gauge how much of an impact that was?
No, I haven't done anything like that. However, I mean, I like to believe that I had an impact because I've done a series on Jeff Lapkoff games, formerly ISI games, and not a lot of people knew about his type of games. And I did like a series on each, like Custer's Last Command and Defend the Alamo and stuff like that. And the reason I did them was because when I went on YouTube and I typed in defend Custer's Last Command, and typed in those, there was not a single video on the entire YouTube. We're talking like billions of millions and billions of videos on there. I'm like, are you serious? There's not one on this game. So I decided, hey, look, I'm going to make a video series, a review, and maybe a video series on these games just to put them out there. And I like to believe that maybe there's some kid or some guy somewhere that types in Custer's Last Stand in YouTube, and my video pops up and says, oh, wow, there's a game of this, and he gets linked to Jeff's Lapkoff's games, and says, I want to buy this, and buys it for $30, and boom, he gets a sale from that. Just having that video out there kind of puts exposure to those small indie developers, and that's kind of why I review games, and I kind of do what I do, because as a hobby, because I want to support these indie developers, because I grew up on playing their games, and I like finding these nuggets, out there, like these small indie developers that is a 1 or 2 man studio and design a game that's amazing. I like getting that out there and telling people, hey, this is an amazing game, and hopefully it'll influence the entire industry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I think it's a good point, especially for indies, for games like that, where, like, to your point, there's literally no exposure. And, how does anybody find anybody's game, especially if you're not on Steam? Well, even if you're on Steam, like, think about the sheer volume of games that are on Steam these days, and, trying to get
especially
discovered.
Project Greenlight, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a nightmare for an indie. I was listening to, not to plug another podcast on the show, but I was listening to a 3 Moves Ahead episode the other day, and they had a developer on. He's an indie developer. I wish I could remember his name or the name of the games that he did. But he was talking about how he released a couple of really successful indie games in, kind of the earlier 2000s, like 2006, 2010, 2012, in that time frame. The years may be off, but it was the early days of Steam. Might have been like 2012 and 2014. And then he came back and, tried to release one in 2016, and it didn't go over nearly as well. And he was talking about how, like, right now, Steam has a ton of options. But he was talking about how right now it's kind of a terrifying time period for indie developers, because as Steam has opened up and the floodgates have really just opened up, and there's a ton of games there, and everybody buys their games through Steam now, not through any other third-party sources, like, there's no visibility for individual indies. So if you don't hit that critical mass of YouTube, channels covering it with like a Total Biscuit covering it, if you don't hit that, that right window where your game is in the new releases at the exact right time, where there's nothing big coming in behind you, these indies, a lot of them are really struggling. And I don't, I think Steam often we hear this sort of rosy picture of like this game took off because of Steam and these developers are doing so great and it's a perfect platform for everybody. But what you don't hear about is the myriad of indies that get buried under the sheer weight of games that are coming out. And I think to your point, like any way that a developer can increase their visibility, has some value because right now there's just so many options out there. We talk about there being a lack of war games covering these certain topics, but the gaming industry as a whole is exploding. And there are just so many games out there. There's so many indie developers out there that, there's a huge influx of supply and only a narrow window of which to get discovered. So, yeah, I mean, I've certainly had people say, hey, I bought a game because I saw you cover it. Someone just said it in the chat. They said they bought Command Modern Air Naval Operations because it was on my channel. I assume they're talking about me. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting period of time where we're saying, hey, build on these less financially lucrative games because we haven't seen them covered. And on the flip side, like, well, there's a billion games out there. So if you don't appeal to the masses, you're going to struggle to make ends meet, especially if this is a big part of your develop, your livelihood. So I mean, Steam's kind of the Walmartification, and we could probably do an episode of the podcast on this. But Steam's basically the Walmartification of video games, where you've got a massive conglomerate driving down prices, which can be good for the end consumer, but it makes it very difficult on the suppliers. And at the end of the day, who knows what that end result is on all, on the consumer when a lot of the suppliers get driven out because they can't compete at those costs. It'll be interesting. I'm not anti-Steam. I love Steam. I've got like 200 games in Steam, but I also recognize that there's, there are impacts that this kind of a service has on the industry as a whole. And, when people refuse to buy full price games, well, those games are full price for a reason. And I mean, I'm not going to go out there and spend more money than I have to. I'm guilty of this too. But now a game dev has to sell 5 times as many copies in order to make ends meet, or more than that. And if they can't get discovered because there's 8,000 games that came out this week on Steam, how do they do that? And sales used to be the big way that you differentiate yourself from other games on Steam. But when you've got 200 games on sale at any time, again, it's got to be a scary time to be a developer on Steam. If you don't have a publisher right now, it's got to be a really scary time. I think we kind of went through a period of time where the value of the publisher kind of declined and the power of the indie increased. But I wonder if we're not swinging back toward an era where you need a publisher to be able to be really successful, or you need to have, be one of those few indies that has name recognition where you can just be successful on your own because you're that popular.
I think, honestly, I think Steam. I've noticed, because what I do this probably like once a month, once every few weeks. I go through Steam and I go through a lot of online websites to find small indie developers, like really small titles. I'll go through like page 30 of, browsing through the Steam, latest games or something like that, or top games, or, newest releases. I'll go to like page 30 trying to find just a nugget in there, and play that game and to see if I want to do a review on it. But I've noticed Steam, when I go to Steam, that they're featuring indie titles, that are like, that are not on the top paid list, like I'll see the top 20, right? And every time I go to the Steam main site, they'll have a couple of banners or whatever, boxes that are featuring games that are nowhere near the top, even a top 50. And they're like these small little indie games. So I feel like they do a little bit there, but I don't know. I try to get these guys exposure. I try to find these little nuggets out there every so often. I'm going to feature a game that came out in the 90s or late 80s on my website, and I found it. It's an old DOS game, but I was planning to do a review on it, first impressions. But I feel like it's critically important for on your point that we need to get these guys exposure. And I feel like, between me and you, people that have channels and publish these videos, to give them the exposure and be like, hey, I found your game, it just got released. I know you're on, page 100 of the Steam newest games, but I want to focus your game and make a review about it. And then, he might just because of our review, he might jump to the top 50 or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to think of like what other alternatives developers could do, and I guess you could say they could develop toward Android or iOS, but you've got a very small percentage of developers, and I think we talked about this in a previous game, but you've got a video or podcast or whatever we're doing now, but you've got a very small percentage of users on iOS and even less so on Android who are willing to go out and spend money on a game up front. It seems like the free-to-play model exists because a lot of developers are willing to, or a lot of players are willing to download it for free and then spend money once they're in the app. But the idea of buying a game for $4.99 or $10.99 or something like that in an iOS or an Android platform, on your iPhone, is very difficult, I think, for a lot of games to survive that way. I think, and they're dealing with an even bigger case of discoverability. How the hell do you stand out amongst 5 million apps in the App Store? Steam is bad. If you think Steam is bad, getting discovered on Steam, good luck getting discovered in the Apple App Store, or the Android Play Store. So it certainly is a case. I mean, I know Matrix was trying to make iOS a big push for some of their games a couple of years ago, and I thought you mentioned in a previous video that that seems to have kind of slowed down or kind of shifted. And I could have sworn that Ian, or was it JD? Someone in Slitherine basically said, listen, we've seen kind of that market penetration there's kind of stagnated over the last few years. I think it was in the last Home of Wargamers, where they kind of talk about the state of the business.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I would say lately, Slitherine is still pushing out some titles, and there's some good ones. For example, the last one was it's actually on my iPhone. I forgot the name of it, but it's well, I had it on my iPhone. I don't have it anymore, which is kind of weird. It'll come to me, but anyway, they've been pushing out some games on iOS. I think they meant. I know they're abandoning. They're not doing anything on the Android platform, primarily because from the developers I've talked to and the articles that I read, people don't buy anything on Android. The entire Android marketplace, majority of people, I would say probably like 95%, don't buy any Android apps. It's all free. And I know a lot of people that refuse to buy anything on Android. In the beginning, when the iOS came out, people were buying iPhone apps. They were buying it for like $5, $10, whether it be a game or this or that. But yeah, I've noticed in the last couple of years, people stop buying apps on iOS too. And not completely as they did on Android, but it's slowing down to, like you were saying, the freemium model where they're doing in-app purchases. People really, I don't understand people, and we always had scratching our heads for stuff like this. When I remember I was talking to a customer one time, and he mentioned something like there was something wrong with his phone. I had to do a DFU, which is I had to remove the software and the firmware on there. And he was very adamant. He was like, "Listen, I need everything back on this phone. It's just it's very, very important. I need every app back." I'm like, "Okay, I'll don't worry, I got you." So I fixed his phone, came back, gave him the phone, and he says, "Is this all my apps back?" I said, "Sure." And he pointed to this one game. It was like a castle in it. And I was just like, "This game, this better run." I was like, and I clicked it. He clicked it, and it loaded it. And I was like, "How much was that app?" He says, "Oh, I don't buy apps." It's like, I refuse to buy apps. Anyone that buys an app is an idiot. And I was just like, okay. I was just like, wow, okay. And he says, I said, "Why are you so, why are you so concerned about this app then?" He said, "Well, I built my whole kingdom here, and I spent, about $1,000 on it." I was like, "Excuse me?" He's just like, "Yeah, I spent about $1,000 building my kingdom." I was just like, just to clarify, you wouldn't spend 99 cents for an app, but you're fine with spending $1,000 inside the app. He was just like, "Yeah." I was like, and I remember walking away, I was just thinking, I was like, I don't understand that mentality. But unfortunately, that mentality changed the entire industry. Now developers can't make money off, they have to sell their apps for free and then entice customers to buy stuff inside the app. And I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I'm more comfortable with, spending $10, $20 on an app. Like Slitherine came out with, a bunch of apps. One of them was Commander of the Great War. I think they sold it for $15 or $20 on iOS, and that's a great game. It's a fully desktop game. But the way the industry is going is they have to give the game out for free and then now sell stuff inside the game for in-app purchasing that levels up to $20. I don't understand that. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is changing the industry, it seems. Although, I don't know. The PC market as a whole may be shrinking and people are going more toward tablets, but I don't think that's true on the gaming side. The difficulty is the wargaming industry typically caters to those kind of people that would probably turn in their PC for an iPad. They don't tend to be the traditional hardcore gamer per se. I think that's the challenge that wargaming is, that it has a more mature, older audience on the average, on the whole. I'm 28, so what the hell am I talking about? And I know plenty of younger YouTubers too who love war games, who cover it, who are younger. But it seems like the stereotype, at the very least, is that the industry is an older demographic. Therefore, it makes it more difficult for them to cover. But I think we're straying into different topics now over the last 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and say we should rein it in. It's been about an hour and 20 minutes, so. I know we're trying to get this down to an hour-long podcast. We failed yet again. That's some homework for both of us. But I did enjoy the discussion about wars that we believe are not adequately covered, and I think that's gonna I think we should probably wrap it up here. What do you think, John? John?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we covered all the bases. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I definitely enjoyed it as well. I hope everybody listening enjoyed it. Continue to tune in. If you don't currently follow us on iOS, please do that. We're over on the iTunes Store. We're also available, here, and I believe any of your Android apps also can link into the podcast as well. It's the Single Malt Strategy Podcast. I'm trying to remember if I even introduced that up front. Oh, one quick thing. We forgot to talk about it last time around, and we didn't talk about it yet this time around. What have you been drinking? Anything different? Anything interesting lately? It wouldn't be the Single Malt Strategy Podcast.
I picked up last night. I picked up a nice bottle of Absolute vodka.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, it was very smooth. I haven't had that in a while.
You drank the whole vodka, the whole bottle in one night?
No, I split it between two, but it was really good. I enjoyed it. I had a little bit too much yesterday because it was kind of my relaxed day from day off from the fire department, school, and everything. So I kind of had a couple of extra drinks, but since we're back into Monday, I kind of took it slow today and. For probably the rest of the week.
Okay. Yeah, no, I picked up 3 bottles of scotch the other day at the store. I got a bottle of Green Label, which I've talked about before, Johnny Walker Green. It's my favorite of the Johnny Walker range. I picked up a bottle of Speyburn, which is a very good, in my opinion, $20 bottle of single malt scotch. It's a 10-year-old, and it's for $20. I think it's the best scotch you can find for a single malt. It's so far I've loved it. It's delicious. It's a Highland single malt scotch that is surprisingly refined for only being 10 years old. It's made by a distillery that mostly makes single malt that gets put into blended scotches, but they've kind of, I guess, ventured into branding their own stuff lately because the single malt industry has really been expanding, whereas the blended malt, blended scotch industry is kind of be contracting. So I think they're trying to build their brand. They've got a very well-regarded 25-year-old that's very expensive, and they've had that for a while. But the 10-year-old is relatively new. I think it's within 10 years old, and it's relatively widely available for only $20. And then I haven't tried it yet, but I bought a 12-year-old of Macallan, which is kind of supposedly among the best of the single malt scotches. It's only the 12-year-old, but haven't tried that yet. But the Speyburn I definitely recommend. The Macallan is also a Highland as well, but I haven't tried it yet, so no verdict on that yet. Maybe next episode.
All right, excellent. I look forward. I might have to pick one of those up next time I stop by the ABC store. Maybe try one of those single malts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've kind of become a single malt scotch kind of fan. Even the Johnny Walker I have is it's a blended malt, so it's a blend of exclusively single malt scotches, unlike most blended scotches. So, I guess I'm becoming a little bit of a malty person, but I wouldn't claim to know anything about. I try and smell it. I try and like figure out like what are the different scents and what are the impacts on my palate. And it's like I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Like I can taste a little bit of peat here and there. I can taste a little bit of char here and there, but other than that, I don't know what I'm doing. I do enjoy drinking it though. So
as long as you enjoy it, that's the most important.
Right? Okay. So I think that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I know there's a lot of discussion going on the stream, so keep that up. I'll stick around a little bit if you guys want to chat a little bit in the chat. But hope you guys all enjoyed. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer and the Strategy Wargamer signing off. Thanks for listening, guys.
See you guys.